There's nothing more closely associated with Melbourne than its famous trams. Indeed, for over 100 years, it has been one of the great tram cities of the world. As many thousands of Melburnians today travel to work on electric trams, how many spare a thought for the forerunner of the electric tram, the cable tram? How few remember. As the second last decade of the 19th century dawned, new and more efficient methods of mass suburban transport were sought. Until this time, horse-drawn vehicles and bicycles were the principal forms of transport. Steam-hauled railways had developed since the 1850s, but a lighter form of fixed-rail transport was needed for the streets of the cities. Hence, the street railway or tramway was developed, initially with horse-drawn vehicles used in Hawthorn, Kew and Royal Parade. Steam trams, which were experimented with in Sydney, then finally an innovative form of propulsion contained not on the vehicle, but in a tunnel under the roadway, a cable-hauled tram. Two men, Francis Clapp and George Duncan, could rightly claim to be the fathers of Melbourne's cable tram system. Clapp, after seeing the results of a line in New Zealand and reading reports from the United States, was convinced that Melbourne was suitable for cable trams. He invited Duncan, an engineer who had been engaged in the building of the initial line in New Zealand, to formulate plans for service in Melbourne. After lengthy debate and deliberation by Parliament, the first cable tram line in Australia opened with minimal fuss on the 11th of November, 1885. By 1920, when the final extension was opened, some 17 routes were in operation with their associated engine houses, covering more than 46 miles of double track and servicing most of the inner suburbs of Melbourne. The heart of the cable tram system was the cable and associated equipment. The cable for each house was first imported from England and then America in a single length sufficient to cover the entire section. Each 1-inch diameter cable had a tensile strength of 90 tons per square inch, which was strong enough to cope with all the trams operating on the route. After unloading, it was taken by horse-drawn vehicle to the engine house, where it was threaded through the tunnel to the terminus, and then returned to the engine house, where it was spliced over a length of about 80 feet to form an endless loop. Splicing was a complex and lengthy task, involving teams of highly skilled workers in an operation lasting several hours. The cable was made of steel and consisted of 6 strands, each of 7 wires, wrapped around a hempen core. The average life of a cable was about 6 months, although this varied from as little as 3 months to as long as 4 years on a lightly used route. The completed splice was almost undetectable and was a tribute to the skill of the workers. The cable ran in a tunnel set midway between the rails. Underneath the streets, it hummed and rumbled over pulleys and around sheaves. To haul the endless cable through the tunnels, engine houses containing huge steam engines were strategically placed along the tram routes. Within the walls of these imposing buildings was a fascinating array of steam-driven machinery, giant wheels, pulleys, ropes and cables. Their all-important purpose was to wind the cable along the tunnels so the grip mechanism on each tram could firmly hold the cable, allowing the tram to be towed along the route. By closing and opening the jaws of the grip on the moving cable, The driver, or Gripman as he was known, controlled the progress of the tram. From his own separate compartment in the centre of the leading vehicle, he used long-handled levers, operating the grip and 2 sets of brakes. The cable trams were a familiar sight on the main thoroughfares of the city in the late 1920s. The automobile was still out of reach of the average wage earner who had to rely on what was then a cheap and highly efficient form of public transport. Services throughout the day were frequent, but at the corner of Collins and Swanston Streets in the evening peak hour between 5 and 6, more than 400 cable trams passed through the intersection. The prosperity of the 1920s was expressed in the architecture of the many large and impressive buildings in and around the city. At the western end, in Spencer Street, the Victorian Railway's head office dominated the view towards the Yarra. On the opposite side of the street, hotels had sprung up to provide accommodation and refreshment for country travellers arriving at Spencer Street Station. Also opposite the Spencer Street Rail Terminal stood the Mail Exchange, which handled interstate, overseas and local mail. Back towards the centre of the city, the commercial heart of Melbourne, Bourke Street, busy and bustling, typical of the pace of city life at that time. By the late 1920s, ladies' hemlines had risen to daring new heights. Men's fashions, however, were still largely conservative. Headwear seemed to be in for both sexes, much to the milliner's delight. Was there anyone in Melbourne not wearing a hat? Collins Street, with its ornate gas lamps and impressive banking chambers, was the financial heart of the nation, while further east, parking spaces, then as today, were at a premium. Horse-drawn transport was still commonplace in the centre of Melbourne, but horsepower of a different kind was gradually taking over. 2 blocks north of the city centre, the Queen Victoria Hospital in Lonsdale Street cared for Melburnians' health needs from the early days. At the weekends, life in the city shifted from business to leisure. And for many Melburnians, this meant only one thing: a weekly visit to the football, cheering their team on to that one day in September, the Grand Final. On a fine spring Saturday of 1929, Collingwood took on Richmond for the Premier's flag. After a long and hard-fought battle, Collingwood finally emerged victors, defeating Richmond by 29 points. By the 1920s, electric tramways had begun appearing on the streets of Melbourne. Parliament had already decided to phase out the cable trams in favour of electric traction and motor buses. The first casualties in this advance in technology were the Swanston Street routes. A W2 class tram passes an almost unrecognisable entrance to the Melbourne Public Library. Electrification was not just confined to the tramways, however. By the end of the 1920s, the Victorian Railways had completed electrifying the suburban passenger network, and rail commuters were being treated to new standards of speed and comfort. With the onset of the Depression in the 1930s, little thought was given to recording the demise of the superseded modes of transport, and even less to preserving examples of them. Fortunately, one cable tram set was retained and later restored for public display. Of the few motion pictures that still exist, those made by Neville Govett are among the best. Here Neville, now in his 70s, revisits cable tram number 1 on display in Russell Street at the rear of the Victorian Science Museum, and recalls that his enthusiasm for filming them was not shared by everyone.
I'm looking back now and realising that I really achieved something. I was laughed at by people, I was ding ding, and what are you doing, sonny, and all this sort of thing, but I had the cooperation of the cable tram employees, and that was a wonderful thing. And do you know that I used to pay my fare for the privilege of travelling on the trams to actually take the film?
Neville's interest in the cable trams had been fostered by his elderly father.
Dad was 53 years older than I, so you can understand that he had an interest in me almost as a grandson. He told me how he saw the Paran to rack line built. Men dug the pits by hand, and good faithful horses carried away the fill, and then he saw all the cables put in, and that was the line upon which I rode for many years. And my father was the man that inspired me to take the films of the cable trams, box brownie pictures and all.
The rolling stock consisted of an enclosed trailer preceded by an open vehicle known universally as the dummy. This was believed to be short for dummy locomotive, since it gave the appearance of hauling the trailer as a locomotive might. In fact, the dummy had no propulsion of its own and was simply hauled along by the cable beneath the road. The gripman controlled the operation of the tram by levers in the dummy. To start the tram, the grip was gradually tightened on the moving cable. To stop, the grip was relaxed, allowing the cable to run freely through the partially opened jaws and the brakes applied. At times, it was necessary to completely remove the cable from the jaws of the grip mechanism, and early models relied on gravity to achieve this. At junctions and termini, this clearing of the grip was vital to prevent serious damage to the cable. Later model grips improved on the release of the cable by forcing it from the jaws. This had to operate unfailingly when required. From the tunnel under the road, the operation of the grip can be clearly seen. To lift the cable into the empty jaws of the grip, a device known as a cable dolly was located at each terminus and junction. The conductor pulled a cord, lifting the cable dolly, in turn directing the cable into the grip. The dolly was counterbalanced to overcome the weight of the moving cable. Another common way of picking up the cable used a slight track deviation, which virtually directed the open jaws onto the cable. While these methods provided for most occasions, there were times when the cable had to be dropped at locations where it could not be readily retrieved. Neville explains how this was overcome.
Well, that presented a slight problem. They seem to have an answer to every one. If he missed picking up a cable, then there would have to be probably a long report put in as to why he missed picking it up, but of course people would get in the way, an accident or something like that would occur. Then the normal procedure was to push the tram around the corner or to the nearest level piece of ground and let it glide slowly to the first pickup point, which was indicated by 2 white marble marks. That was pickup. 3 meant throw. 2 were to pick up. 1 was, that's where he should stop the front of the dummy. Now, they always tried to do that. However, they did carry a hook, and they would go out underneath into the slot, and then they would, with sheer manpower, pick it up. It was a very, very hard job, but they would pick it up and they would ease it in. On the other hand, another system was that the tram coming at the rear, who probably had the cable and had not lost his cable, they would just ease it into the crossbar at the back, and they would push very, very carefully until he was in a position, the tram that had lost the cable, to pick it up again. And then it would be all right. A wave and away.
One of the busiest cable tram routes ran the length of Burke Street, past Parliament House, and served two of Melbourne's northern suburbs. At the junction of the two routes outside the exhibition buildings, Nicholson Street trams had to stop and change the points to continue their journey towards North Fitzroy. At the terminus, near the Inner Circle railway line at North Fitzroy, the dummy was run around the trailer, which was recoupled with some effort by the conductor prior to the journey back to the city. The other route which travelled along Burke Street was the Northcote line. Beginning in High Street, the trams travelled through Clifton Hill and Collingwood before joining the Nicholson Street line at Gertrude Street for the run to the city. Burke Street, overlooked by Victoria's imposing Parliament House, traversed the retailing and entertainment heart of the city. With its generous grades and freedom from curves, this thoroughfare was ideally suited to cable traction, and regular patronage for the cable trams was ensured by the many theatres and the major department stores, Buckley and Nunn and the Meyer Emporium. At the busy Elizabeth Street intersection, the cable trams rumbled past the General Post Office. Opened in 1867, this building replaced an earlier one on the site originally set aside by Melbourne surveyor Robert Hoddle to serve the postal needs of the city. Further west, the line climbed towards Queen Street, from where views back east through the city were unsurpassed. The final run down to the terminus concluded at Spencer Street, opposite the main country rail terminal. As the traveller hurried across the road to catch his train, the conductor and gripman set about shunting the dummy and trailer once again to prepare for their return journey back through the city, and the cable picked up for the run eastwards. The cables were driven by steam engines housed on 12 sites around the system. The engine house at the corner of Gertrude and Nicholson Streets had a typical late 19th century facade. The towering 150-foot high brick chimney and constant exhaust of steam gives some indication of the massiveness of the machinery inside. At the heart of the engine house were the 6 huge Babcocks and Wilcox boilers. These consumed prodigious quantities of coal, which was hand-shoveled by teams of workers for up to 18 hours a day. This was essential to keep up the constant supply of steam required by the engines. This steam was delivered to the cylinders by overhead pipes at a constant pressure of 80 pounds per square inch. The engine, with its 24-inch bore and 48-inch stroke, like most of the equipment in the engine houses, was manufactured locally to precision standards. Constant driving speed was necessary for the smooth operation of the system, and this was regulated by a standard type of centrifugal governor, which maintained the engine speed of 80 revs per minute. Reliability of the equipment was kept at a peak by the highly skilled staff whose pride and dedication became a trademark of the Melbourne cable tram system. The use of mechanical instruments, together with the trained eye, were foremost in the early detection of problems. For the final cable drive, the engine speed was reduced to 27 revs per minute by giant rope-driven pulleys. Underneath the roadway, outside the building, was a labyrinth of tunnels and cableways. It was from here that the cable was directed by a system of pulleys to a large angled sheave, and then into the engine house. En route, it passed through a metal eye which detected any broken strands. This in turn activated an electric alarm bell and registered on a display board. The cable then travelled round the 22-foot diameter driving wheel and onto an inspection race. It was here that one of the most important, though least exciting jobs took place, that of visually inspecting the moving cable for any sign of damage. The position of the splice was monitored by a location disc on which could also be marked any minor damage for later repair. Constant tension had to be maintained on the cable at all times, as its length varied from day to day according to load, temperature and aging. To achieve this, a counterweighted tensioning carriage automatically adjusted minor changes in the length of the cable. Before leaving the engine house, it passed beneath a lubricating tap and on through the jaws of an open clamp, which, during shutdown of the system for maintenance or repairs, was closed to firmly hold the stationary cable. The cable then passed out into the street once again to continue its journey to the terminus and back. The Collingwood line entered the city from the north by way of Lygone and Russell Streets. Crossing Latrobe Street with the Magistrates' Court on the corner, the route continued past the museum and the then tree-filled site, now occupied by restored cable tram number 1. At the bottom of the hill, the cable was released and the tram free-wheeled around the corner into Lonsdale Street. The impressive brick building is the Queen Victoria Hospital, which closed in 1987. Originally opened as the Melbourne Public Hospital in 1848, records show a somewhat shaky beginning when, in its first year of operation, nearly 1/3 of its patients died. After crossing Swanston Street, the tram continued to its terminus at Elizabeth Street near the Lonsdale Street entrance to the Myer Emporium. The tram was then shunted in readiness for the return journey to Collingwood. Approaching the crest of the hill in Russell Street and still less than a mile from the centre of the city, the tram passed the ivy-covered Old Melbourne Jail, where bushranger Ned Kelly was hanged. Opened in 1854, it's now a penal museum. In 1934, the worst of the Depression was over, and Melbourne slowly returned to some prosperity, with a rash of new buildings springing up to change the city's skyline. To the city's south, the Shrine of Remembrance, built in 1929 to honour the soldiers who fell in the First World War, commanded respect from its prominent position on St Kilda Road. Nearby, horse riding was a popular pastime on the Tan around the outskirts of the Botanic Gardens. Within easy walking distance of the city, These gardens, with more than 80 acres of lawns, gardens and ornamental lakes, are considered among the most beautiful in the world. "1934 saw both tragedy and triumph. In that year, the great Hawthorn floods caused devastation within a few miles of the heart of Melbourne, when the nearby A.R.E River burst its banks after the heaviest rainfall in decades. With acres of parkland covered in a raging torrent and buildings half submerged in the muddy water, the main form of transport became the boat or canoe, much to the delight of local children taking a day off school. For those without the genuine article, a piece of roofing iron, folded in the middle and nailed to a piece of wood at each end, provided an excellent substitute. Even the trip home from the pub seemed more difficult than usual. The floats of another kind, as Melbourne celebrated its centenary. The population was out in force to see one of the biggest processions in the city's history, depicting various aspects of its development. As well as the beautifully decorated floats, caricatures of popular stage and screen personalities of the day were also part of the parade. A similar float procession is still held in Melbourne as part of the annual Moomba festivities. A highlight of the 1934 parade was the visit of England's famous Grenadier Guards. The streets of Melbourne were adorned for the centenary with bunting and specially designed street poles known as lolly sticks. In contrast to busy Swanston Street, a quieter day in Burke Street saw a lightly loaded tram trundling past more of these unusual poles. The Nicholson Street workshops in North Fitzroy carried out major repairs, repainting and complete overhaul of dummies and trailers. A hand-powered traverser was used at the workshops to move the vehicles between the various maintenance areas. An inspection pit, which all trams passed over before starting their day's operation, was used to routinely check brakes and wheels. As well, a turntable enabled the vehicles to be turned regularly to even the weathering of the paintwork and wear on the wheels. Recalling his visits to the workshops, Neville Gollett speaks of the pride and dedication of the men employed there.
The pride in the work of the men was magnificent. They loved their jobs. They were tidy, neat, and men that would give service. Oh, it was wonderful. I do know that when a tram would be taken off the road for maintenance and repainting, that when it went out early at about 5 o'clock in the morning from one of the depots, I think it was Nicholson Street in the latter days, that men would actually be dusting the cars with the dusters as it went onto the road, and they would stand and admire it as it went out onto the road.
To enter service for the day, the trams were towed from the depot, and once on the road, the raised grip was lowered by block and tackle through trapdoors in the road to the cable below. With the grip firmly bolted into position, the conductor lifted the cable into the jaws with his hook, and the tram moved off, leaving the trapdoors to be closed. From 1921, paper tickets known as flimsies were issued in return for fares paid. Up until this time, however, the bell punch fare collection system had been used. The conductor had different fare value strips attached to his jacket. On payment of a fare, he used his bell punch to nip the appropriate strip. At the same time, a bell rang advising the passenger the fare had been registered. At the completion of his shift, the conductor's punch was unlocked and the paper punch-outs were counted and checked with the dial reading, the tickets and the cash. This ensured that all fares had been accounted for. In addition to cable warning devices at engine houses, boxes maintaining direct communication with them were installed along the routes. When a problem arose that interrupted the service, the conductor or gripman could unlock the nearest box and relay a specific message to the engine house, where it was recorded on punched paper tape. Appropriate action could then be taken to rectify the problem. A tower on top of the Nicholson Street engine house contained levers to operate the junction points at the busy intersection below. However, this system was replaced in later years by a point lever mounted in the roadway, operated directly by the tram conductor. When a tram reached the junction, the conductor raised the lever in the road to change the points. The cable dolly was operated to engage the new cable, and the conductor rejoined the tram. At certain points along the routes, illuminated signs or white marble strips in the roadway advised the gripman where to release the cable. For example, at intersections where two lines crossed, with one cable passing beneath the other, and also at corners.
When the tram came to a curve, the general idea was to save wear and tear on the cable, and this was instigated by a Mr. Duncan, who was the marvellous engineer that installed the trams for Melbourne. The cable did not follow the line. It went straight out and turned at a right angle. Therefore, the gripman had to release the cable on approaching the curve. The tram went round on gravity, and then the cable was picked up to resume its journey around the corner. That saved tremendous wear and tear on the cable. Now, of course, you realise that in some places where there was an uphill grade, it was necessary to retain the cable. There are certain sections of the city where that had to be, especially on the Lonsdale Street section.
Although not travelling very fast, the trip around the curve could unbalance the passengers. And to warn them, the gripman would shout, "Mind the curve." It was this term, more than any other, that became synonymous with Melbourne's cable trams. But what if the unpropelled tram did not get around the curve?
Well, the passengers got off and pushed. No trouble at all.
Keeping the system running meant in some cases the performance of somewhat dangerous jobs with little thought for personal safety. This included inspecting and greasing the whirring pulleys which carried the cable from tiny manholes in the middle of the street. Back at the engine houses, those working with the heavy machinery too were faced with many physical dangers. While just moving around the engine pit could be a life-threatening act in itself. The Collins Street routes originally served North Fitzroy and Victoria Bridge to the northeast of the city. The dignified and professional people of Collins Street objected to the replacement of their cable trams by the noisier electric trams with their unacceptable overhead wires. After the closure of Collins Street for conversion to electric traction, the Port Melbourne and South Melbourne beach routes continued to operate from a new terminus at the corner of Market and Collins Streets. The route south from the city went under the 4-track railway viaduct at Flinders Street, where electric trains had been operating in the suburban area since soon after World War I. Once over the Yarra River and under the Port Melbourne and St Kilda railway lines, the two routes separated at City Road. The South Melbourne Beach line ascended the slight rise in Clarendon Street, then continued the rest of its journey on relatively level roads to the beach. A short distance west of South Melbourne Beach was the Port Melbourne line terminus. The extensive wharves at Port Melbourne saw the regular arrival and departure of large cargo vessels and passenger liners in the days before travel by air was popular or affordable. From here, passengers wishing to travel to the other side of Port Phillip Bay could take one of the huge paddle steamers to such popular resorts as Queenscliff and Sorrento. The Hygeia was one of 3 paddle steamers that plied Port Phillip Bay on excursion traffic for Bay Steamers Limited between Port Melbourne and the southern Bayside resorts. Built in England in 1890, she was faster, roomier and more luxuriously appointed than her slightly older sister, the Ozone. Although the pleasure trips reached their peak in 1910, the company took delivery of the PS Waroona, the last vessel built for the Port Phillip Bay run. By 1917, patronage had fallen off and the Ozone was retired, followed in 1931 by the Hygeia, and finally the Waroona, just prior to World War II. The vessels themselves featured promenade decks, extensive saloons, dining rooms, food stalls and bookstands. The Waroona even had a barber shop, scullery and baker's shop. The outing for most travellers, however, was enjoyed relaxing in the salt-tinged air of the open decks. The Port Melbourne railway station stood adjacent to the bridge beyond the cable tram terminus. The railway line from the port to the city opened in 1854 and was the first steam-operated train line in Australasia. As with the cable trams, it also has passed into history. It was closed in 1987 and converted to a light railway or tramway, joining the existing electric tram system. As the dummy always had to be the leading car, it was necessary at each terminus to shunt it around the trailer. When the terminus was located on a favourable gradient, gravity was skillfully employed to do the work. At places where the ground was level, the help of passengers and bystanders was often enlisted. In Elizabeth Street, the heavy bogie trailers required special attention. These longer cars were used almost exclusively on the Brunswick line north of Melbourne, which ascended Elizabeth Street from Flinders Street, then proceeded along tree-lined Royal Parade past the University of Melbourne. The small number of curves meant these longer, higher capacity trailers could be used on this route. The extra weight of these vehicles taxed the workhorse at the depot to its limits. The gripman had pride of place in the centre of the dummy. Exposed to the elements in the relative openness of this vehicle, he was responsible for the safe carriage of the passengers and smooth operation of the tram. Neville Gobbett again.
Well, he stood in this compartment which was strictly his. No way in the world anybody was allowed in it, nor to stand in the front. The signal was to start the tram, 2 rings. He would release both brakes and then he would push it forward. And then you might be a horse walking along the line. And then he would put it forward and the tram would go under its way.
Various rules and regulations were displayed inside the dummy, including at least one that was not always strictly observed.
Well, it was a rule. As a matter of fact, I think it was regarded that the gripman just loved talking to the passengers. I do know that Ron Horton, I'd like to quote him, the man who drove the last cable tram, actually made a statement that when he was transferred to the electric system and he sat in the little box up front, he felt so lonely after having been in the cable tram dummy and spoken to the passengers. Everybody had a word to say, inspectors and all. Oh yes, it was a rule that just was there, but it just wasn't observed.
By 1938, the Burke Street lines were the only route still in operation. As early as 1924, the first steps towards closure of the cable tram system were taken when tracks at the northern end of Swanston Street were closed for conversion to electric traction. New loops and terminal shunts were installed to allow the truncated routes to continue, albeit temporarily. In August 1925, the first complete route was closed, the Windsor Esplanade line, which had been the last to open. The first line opened, that to Richmond, closed on the 30th of June 1927. The honour of the final run was bestowed on tram number 1, now on display at the museum. When the South Melbourne Beach and Port Melbourne lines closed in 1937, all that remained were the Burke Street lines, which soldiered on for a further 3.5 years. At Spring Street, all on board, including the cameraman, had some trouble holding on as the tram negotiated the curve. The route then passed the historic Princess Theatre, opened in 1886, just 12 months before the Burke Street cable trams first brought patrons to its doors. The Princess has outlasted by nearly half a century the cable trams that served it so well. The northward-bound trams left Nicholson Street at the Exhibition Buildings and Melbourne Aquarium, turning east into Gertrude Street and passing the engine house that powered their cable. After turning into Smith Street, the trams travelled through the suburban shopping centre of Collingwood, on through North Fitzroy and Clifton Hill, before reaching High Street on the last leg of their journey to Northcote. By the start of the Second World War, the electric tram had almost completely replaced the cable tram as street rail transport in Melbourne. The retired vehicles were being sold off and carted away, and amidst much dust and noise, their tracks removed from the streets. Although performed with great speed and efficiency, this demolition work created as much disruption for road users of a now much larger Melbourne as had the original construction some 55 years earlier. The W-class electric tram soon became a common sight in the streets of Melbourne, and the cable trams were quickly forgotten as attention focused on events unfolding half a world away in Europe. As the final months of cable tram operation approached, colour movie films started to become available to the serious amateur. Richard Bull took the opportunity to combine this rare colour film of his family with a cable tram ride on the Northcote line just prior to its closure. As twilight approached on the 24th of October 1940, passengers unknowingly rode the cable trams to their Saturday night entertainment for the last time. Later in the evening, to their surprise, they had to ride home in double-decker buses, which had replaced the trams from 9 p.m. The buses themselves were replaced on the routes in 1956 by electric trams. On the Monday following the cable tram closure, the press paid it little attention, with the Argus giving one column on page 2 and the Age a slightly more detailed coverage on page 8. very little pictorial record of the final hours of this once great system survives. Little evidence now remains of Melbourne's cable tram system. The last piece of track at the corner of Burke and Spencer Street was removed in 1987 when alterations were made to the electric tram lines. Few vehicles have been preserved. And though some remaining buildings, such as the engine house at the corner of Bromby Street and St Kilda Road, are unrecognisable, others, like the one in North Melbourne, still retain some of their former character. Melbourne's system closed before sentiment and nostalgia were in vogue. This, coupled with World War II, put paid to any preservation schemes. That the system is fondly remembered today bears tribute to the dedication of the tram crews and the men in the engine houses, whose pride and skills were then just an accepted part of their everyday work. The friendly bell has long gone from the streets of Melbourne. So too, the drone of the cable beneath the streets, and the cheerful cry, "Mind the curve." All that now remains of this once great system are a few ageing relics and some fading memories from a time when Melburnians were commuting by cable.